Our democracy, the cornerstone of modern politics, the shining beacon of freedom and equality. But what if I told you that one of history's greatest thinkers feared it? Yes, Aristotle, the father of Western philosophy, saw democracy as fundamentally flawed. Why? Because at its core, it's a system that can tear society apart. Now, before you rage quit over this blasphemy against the religion of modernity, hear me out. In our previous video, we dissected oligarchy, the rule of the rich. We saw how the wealthy few can manipulate a system for their own gain. And now we're flipping the script. We're diving into what happens when the majority rules for their own benefit, potentially at the expense of everyone else. Aristotle had extensively studied various political regimes across the Greek world, analyzing over 150 different states. But his insights weren't just theoretical. He had a front-row seat to much of the political drama of his time. Born in Stagira, a Greek colony on the coast of Thrace, he later witnessed the rise of Philip II and the expansion of Macedonian power. He then spent 2 decades in Athens, experiencing its democracy firsthand during a tumultuous period. Later, he even tutored Alexander the Great, giving him a unique perspective on monarchy. He wasn't just a thinker in an ivory tower. He was a keen observer of real-world politics, and his critiques were rooted in the hard-learned lessons of history. This gave him a solid understanding of how different governments worked or failed. And in his mind-blowing work, Politics, Aristotle laid it out plainly. A tyranny is a government where only one person's interests matter. An oligarchy cares only about the rich, and a democracy only the poor. None of these forms of government aim for the common good. This isn't just some ancient philosophy. It's a warning we should at least consider. Aristotle saw dangers in democracy that might surprise you. He believed it could lead down a path of instability, conflict, and even worse. But how? And why? That's exactly what we're going to explore in this video. At the heart of Aristotle's critique of democracy lies a big concern: its potential disregard for the rule of law. So we'll first need to understand what exactly he meant by the law. For Aristotle, the law wasn't just a set of rules or regulations. It was the very foundation of a just and stable society. He saw law as the embodiment of reason, an impartial authority that should govern both rulers and citizens. This law was meant to serve the common good, balance competing interests, and cultivate virtue among citizens. Crucially, Aristotle believed that the law should govern rather than individuals or groups subject to their own passions and interests. This rational order was supposed to be a safeguard against arbitrary power, whether wielded by a king, an aristocracy, or a democratic majority. However, Aristotle observed that in democracies, like tyrannies and oligarchies, this crucial safeguard often falls by the wayside. In politics, he stated, everything is decided by majority vote, not by the law. This simple line cuts to the core of democracy's potential flaw. In a pure democracy, decisions are made by whoever can rally the most people to their side. It doesn't matter if these decisions are wise, just, or beneficial to society as a whole. All that matters is numbers. This means that the most knowledgeable or virtuous members of society, who according to Aristotle are always a minority, can be overruled by a majority that might be acting out of self-interest or ignorance. So Aristotle compared democracy to tyranny, but a tyranny of the majority rather than of a single individual. He saw that majority rule could lead to the oppression of minority groups, resulting in injustice and instability. And no, he wasn't talking about foreign minorities here, but about any group that found itself outnumbered, including the rich, the educated, or even poor people who didn't align with the majority view. His concerns about majority rule extend beyond his own time. For example, in a modern democracy, tax policies are often determined solely by popular vote in Parliament. The majority, seeking to fund public projects, might vote for taxes that disproportionately burden a minority of wealth holders. Or it could be social policies decided purely by majority opinion, potentially alienating those with different moral values and even forcing them to pay for it. Even within the majority, individuals might find themselves unexpectedly misaligned with the majority view on certain issues, suddenly experiencing the vulnerability of minority status. This tyranny of the majority, Aristotle argued, was just as capable of causing injustice and uncertainty as any single tyrant. and without the rule of a rational, impartial law to check its power, democracy could devolve into a system where might in the form of numbers makes right. But Aristotle's concerns about democracy didn't stop at its disrespect for the law. He also worried about how supporters of democracy tend to misunderstand the concept of equality. While democracy prides itself on the idea that all citizens are equal, he argued that this principle often gets distorted into something more dangerous, the belief that all citizens are equal in all respects, including their ability to govern. Aristotle saw this as a serious flaw. He recognized that while people should be equal in their rights as citizens, they are not equal in their virtues, skills, or capacities. Just as oligarchies err by promoting inequality in all things, where the wealthy are considered superior in all respects, democracies can fall into the opposite trap of assuming equality in everything. In other words, while you can try to level the playing field in terms of wealth or resources, you can't equally distribute virtue or competency. Not everyone has the same abilities, wisdom, or capacity to lead, and pretending otherwise is a recipe for disaster. When a democracy ignores these differences in ability or merit and distributes political power equally across all citizens, it elevates the unqualified to positions of power. For Aristotle, this was a danger to society as a whole. In his view, governance requires expertise and a dedication to the common good. Without recognizing those with genuine skill, knowledge, and virtue, a society becomes vulnerable to poor decision-making, leading to instability. History is full of examples where societies tried to make everyone equal in ways that ignored real differences in talent and ability. Sometimes, in the push to treat everyone the same, those best suited to make decisions were overlooked or even outright removed from society, to the detriment of said society. So, the question is, can a society truly thrive if it fails to acknowledge and incorporate the talents and qualifications of its most capable members? Or will it, as Aristotle feared, undermine its own foundations in the name of an equality that ignores the reality of human differences? Aristotle argued that this misunderstanding of equality opened the door to an arguably more insidious problem, the potential for corruption and conflict. One of his key concerns was the temptation for unfair redistribution of wealth. He warned that when the poor majority holds power, there is a strong incentive to use that power to take from the rich and redistribute wealth to themselves. This, he argued, could lead to tension and instability within the state. As he pointed out in Politics, should the poor take the wealth of the rich just because they're the majority? They could then divide among themselves what belongs to the wealthy. That would be the greatest injustice. For Aristotle, this unchecked ability of the majority to take whatever they want from the wealthy not only violates principles of fairness, but also threatens the very fabric of society. He believed that if the poor simply rob the rich of all they have, it signals the end of society, a point that history seems to have proven accurate in more recent times. Now, don't think Aristotle was an apologist for the rich, though. He supported the concept of private property because it motivated people to strive for their own success, but he wasn't against some level of sharing or redistribution to prevent extreme poverty. He recognized the dangers of excessive wealth accumulation and the social issues it could cause, as discussed in my video on oligarchy. As he wrote in Politics, "To stop people from stealing out of need, make sure everyone has enough to live on." For Aristotle, ensuring a basic level of subsistence was crucial to maintaining social stability and reducing the temptation for unjust acts, a point we'll talk more about later in this video. When these principles of moderation in wealth distribution are ignored, Aristotle argued, democratic systems become corrupt and prone to the abuse of power. The temptation to use majority rule to unfairly take from others can erode trust, encourage populism, and lead to a cycle of corruption where leaders promise more and more to their supporters at the expense of a cohesive and stable society. This, in turn, creates friction between the poor majority and the rich minority. When one group feels empowered to redistribute wealth at will, while another feels targeted and unfairly treated, tensions arise. Aristotle recognized that this conflict could lead to deeper divisions and instability, noting that people with great abilities won't easily accept being treated the same as everyone else. Therefore, they are often ready to stir up trouble and rebellion. This atmosphere of division will quickly lead to factionalism, where different groups within a democracy compete for control and dominance. And when the unity of a society breaks down into these factional struggles, the stability and common good that Aristotle saw as the goal of any government become harder to achieve. While these concerns are rooted in ancient times, they keep coming up whenever the rich and poor start battling over resources. When a society turns into a tug of war between those who have and those who don't, it drives people apart and makes unity almost impossible. The more this divide grows, the easier it becomes for conflict and corruption to take hold, pulling everyone further away from a stable society. As these issues of conflict intensify, Aristotle saw an even greater danger looming on the horizon. If not effectively mitigated, all of these issues we've discussed, the temptation for unfair redistribution of rule and resources, the friction between economic classes, and the rise of factionalism, eventually leads to something even worse, the fall of democracy. While Aristotle wasn't a fan of democracy, he did consider it the least bad of the three perverted regime forms, and he warned that when these problems are allowed to fester, they will cause a democracy to devolve into one of the two forms of government that are even worse. One of the primary risks Aristotle identified is the slide into oligarchy. When conflicts between the poor and the rich reach a breaking point, the wealthy minority, feeling threatened and targeted, may decide to take matters into their own hands. Aristotle noted that this kind of tension often leads the rich to band together, using their resources and influence to seize power and establish an oligarchy. This shift replaces the rule of the many with a system where power is concentrated in the hands of those with wealth, leading to even greater inequalities and other types of abuses of power. But perhaps even more concerning to Aristotle was the risk of tyranny emerging from within a democracy, particularly through the rise of charismatic leaders. These figures have a knack for manipulating the masses, telling them what they want to hear to gain power. As Aristotle put it, the demagogues are the people's flatterers, just as flatterers are to a tyrant. In other words, a demagogue is someone who plays to the desires and emotions of the majority, not unlike a courtier who tells a tyrant whatever he wants to hear. Once in power, these leaders can slowly dismantle democratic structures, consolidating authority under themselves and moving toward tyranny. One example is Pisistratus, a leader in ancient Athens who, as discussed in my video on tyranny, used his popularity and promises to the poor to secure power and eventually establish himself as a tyrant not once or twice, but 3 times. And we don't have to look too far back in time to see how democracies can be vulnerable to leaders who rise to power by tapping into public frustration and making sweeping promises. Time and again, we've seen how charismatic figures can consolidate control by appealing to specific groups or exploiting economic and social divides, weaken democratic institutions, and steer their nations away from the rule of law. These leaders often frame their actions as necessary for national unity or economic stability, but the end result is a system where power becomes more centralized and dissent more dangerous. When a democracy's foundations are shaken, it doesn't take much for it to slip into something far less democratic. However, while Aristotle did have several criticisms of democracy, he didn't completely reject the idea of rule by the people. Instead, he suggested a different system that could avoid the problems of both democracy and oligarchy. He called this system polity, also often translated as a constitutional government. This is one of his true forms of government that mixes elements of both, aiming for something more balanced and stable. A key component of polity is the importance of a constitution. For Aristotle, a solid constitution is essential for creating a stable government that the people can trust. It sets clear laws that all citizens, from the rulers to the common people, must follow. A well-constructed constitution creates a foundation for fair laws and leadership, making it harder for a government to slip into chaos or tyranny. Without this strong legal framework, the risks of corruption, factionalism, and abuse of power become much higher. But with a solid constitution in place, polity aims to balance the voices of both the rich and the poor, ensuring fair representation without allowing either group to run the show. And this is where the middle class comes in. Aristotle believed the middle class should hold most of the power in a polity, and he argued that society should actively encourage a large middle class. He saw this group as the key to maintaining stability because they sit between the extremes of wealth and poverty. A strong middle class acts as a buffer, preventing the rich from dominating the poor and vice versa. To quote Aristotle, The most ideal state is one where the middle class dominates and is larger and more respected than both the rich and the poor. Unlike the wealthy, who have the time and inclination to meddle in politics for personal gain, or the poor, who have a lot to gain from taking power, the middle class tends to respect the laws that protect their way of life. They are less likely to be swayed by extreme ideas or political schemes because they have a vested interest in keeping things balanced. Another reason Aristotle thought the middle class would be better at following the rules is that they are busy with their own lives. They are focused on their work, property, and families, and would generally only engage in politics when necessary, such as attending assemblies or courts. This makes them less likely to constantly seek power or cause disruptions. Their focus on personal affairs keeps them grounded and more committed to a stable and just system. In other words, for Aristotle, polity was a practical solution, a way to use the good parts of democracy and oligarchy without falling into their traps. It provides a more balanced and fair way to run things, making sure power is shared fairly, laws are respected, and a strong constitution keeps society together. As we come to the end of our exploration, Aristotle's critique of democracy leaves us with a lot to consider. He pointed out some significant risks: the tendency to sidestep the rule of law, the lack of emphasis on merit, the potential for corruption and conflict, and the danger of devolving into even worse forms of government. He was wary of democracy for a reason, and I think it's fair to look at why. His idea of polity offers a different path, one that aims for balance and stability, avoiding the pitfalls of extremes, but it wasn't his preferred regime type. So it begs the question, is there a better way to run a society? I'm curious to hear what you think. Do Aristotle's critiques make sense in our modern world? Could his concept of polity be the answer to some of today's challenges, or is the solution something entirely different? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this discussion enlightening, consider joining our community on Patreon. Your support helps us continue exploring these important ideas and bringing them to more people. Plus, you'll get access to exclusive content like audio-only versions of our videos. Thank you for watching.